The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy when the world outside is asleep, but the storm inside your heart refuses to rest. Everyone in the house had gone to bed. The lights were off, the doors were closed, and the silence filled every corner of the room. But on one side of the bed, someone was still awake, staring at the ceiling, eyes tired, but sleep refusing to come. Because sometimes the heart carries things that the tongue cannot explain to anyone. Maybe it was the weight of mistakes. Maybe it was guilt that kept whispering, "Time, you went too far this time." Maybe it was pain from people who promised they would stay, but walked away. And in that moment, it felt like the whole world had moved on. Friends had stopped calling. Messages had stopped coming. Even the people who once said, "I'm always here for you," were no longer around. The room felt colder than usual, and slowly the tears began to fall. Not loud sobbing, not dramatic cries, just quiet tears, the kind that fall when a person feels like no one would understand, even if they tried to explain. You know those moments when your chest feels tight, like something is sitting on your heart, when you replay every mistake again and again in your mind. Why did I say that? Why did I make that decision? Why did I become this person? The thoughts come like waves, one after another, until the heart feels exhausted. And sometimes the hardest part isn't the problem itself. It's the feeling that you are facing it alone. That night, the person sitting on that bed felt exactly that, alone. The phone screen lit up for a moment. No new messages, no notifications, just silence again. They looked around the dark room and whispered to themselves, "There's no one I can talk to." Because sometimes people judge before they listen. Sometimes they remind you of your mistakes instead of helping you heal from them. So the words stayed locked inside the chest, but the tears kept coming. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, and in the middle of that silence, something unusual happened. The heart remembered something it had almost forgotten. Not a person, not a solution, but a name. Allah. For a moment, the person hesitated, because when you feel distant from Allah, even turning to Him can feel difficult. The mind begins to whisper things like, "After everything you've done, how can you face Him? Your sins are too many. You should have come back earlier." And that whisper can make a person feel even more ashamed. But the tears didn't stop. And sometimes when the heart is truly broken, it stops arguing with those whispers. Slowly, they sat up. The house was still silent. The clock ticked quietly on the wall. They walked to the bathroom, the cold floor touching their feet, each step heavy with emotion. The water from wudu felt different that night. Cool, calming, almost as if it was washing more than just the face and hands, as if it was washing away layers of pain that had been building for so long. When they stood on the prayer mat, the room was still dark. No audience, no one watching, no one to impress, just a servant and their Lord. For a few seconds, they didn't even know what to say. Because when the heart carries so much pain, words sometimes disappear. They raised their hands slowly, and the tears came again, this time stronger. Because something inside finally realized, even if no one else saw those tears, Allah did. Even if no one else understood the pain, Allah already knew. Every sleepless night, every silent breakdown, every moment when the heart felt like it couldn't continue, He had seen it all. And in that quiet room, with trembling hands raised in the darkness of the night, the person finally spoke the words that had been trapped inside their chest for so long. Gyala. The voice cracked before a sentence could finish. More tears fell, not because the pain was gone yet, but because for the first time in a long time, the heart no longer felt completely alone. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in a person's life is not when the problem disappears. It is the moment they realize that while the world may not see their tears, their Lord never missed a single one. The night had already wrapped the world in silence. Streetlights glowed faintly outside. Houses were dark, windows closed, curtains still. One by one, the lights of the world had turned off as people surrendered to sleep after long days filled with noise, worries, and endless distractions. Cars had stopped moving, phones had gone quiet, conversations had faded. It was the part of the night when everything slowed down, but not every heart was resting. In a small room, someone lay awake again. The body was tired, but the mind refused to sleep. Thoughts wandered through memories, regrets, fears about tomorrow, and questions that had no answers. The ceiling above seemed to hold the weight of everything they had been carrying inside. Sometimes the heart becomes so full that even breathing feels heavy. Earlier that day, they had smiled in front of people. They had laughed at jokes, responded politely, and acted like everything was normal. No one noticed the storm behind those calm eyes, because the world often sees the smile, but it rarely sees the struggle behind it. Now the mask was gone. In the darkness of the room, there was no need to pretend anymore. They turned to the side, hoping sleep would come, but it didn't. The mind kept replaying things over and over again. Mistakes, conversations that went wrong, words that hurt someone, opportunities that were lost. The whispers inside the mind kept repeating, if only you had done things differently. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Outside, the night grew deeper. The quiet became thicker, but something else was happening at that exact moment. Something the person on that bed could not see with their eyes. Above the silent cities, above the sleeping neighborhoods, above the endless darkness of the sky, the gates of mercy were open. While the world slept, a divine invitation was echoing through the unseen. A call not announced through loudspeakers. A call not written on billboards. A call meant only for hearts that were awake. The person sat up slowly, not because someone told them to, not because of an alarm, but because something inside their chest felt like it was being pulled towards something greater than the pain they were carrying. They glanced at the clock. It was late, the kind of late when most people would say, just go to sleep. The kind of late when the world assumes nothing important is happening. But in reality, the most powerful conversations between servants and their Lord often happen at this exact time. They stepped out of bed quietly. The house was completely still. Even the smallest sounds felt loud in the silence. The floor creaked softly as they walked. The air felt cooler, calmer, almost as if the night itself was inviting them to slow down. They performed wudu, letting the water run across their hands, their face, their arms. Each drop of water felt refreshing in a way that words could not describe, as if the heart was preparing for something sacred Back in the room, the prayer mat was spread on the floor, a simple piece of fabric. Yet it had witnessed countless tears, countless whispers, countless moments when people came broken and left lighter. The person stood on it slowly. Their heart was beating faster now, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. A feeling that this mom, that mattered more than anything that had happened during the day. They raised their hands. For a moment, there was silence. The tongue hesitated. Because sometimes, when you finally stand before Allah, you realize how small your problems are compared to His greatness, yet how important they are because He allowed you to bring them to Him. The room was still dark. No audience, no cameras, no people praising the act of worship. Just one servant standing in the quietest part of the night, and above them, the one who created the night itself. At that hour, when the stars watch over a sleeping world, there exists a door that opens, not a door made of wood or metal, a door of mercy, a door of forgiveness, a door that does not open because someone is perfect. It opens because someone is sincere. The person standing on that prayer mat knew they were not perfect. They knew their past carried mistakes. They knew there were moments when they had forgotten Allah, moments when they had delayed prayers, moments when they had allowed the world to distract them. But the beauty of that door is that it does not ask for perfection. It asks for return. And sometimes the most beautiful return happens when the world is not watching, when the servant whispers instead of shouting, when the servant whispers instead of shouting, when the tears fall instead of the pride speaking. The person bowed their head in prayer, their forehead touched the ground, and suddenly the heart that had felt so heavy earlier in the night began to release the emotions it had been holding back. Because there is something powerful about knowing that at this exact moment, while millions of people sleep, the door between you and Allah is open. There was a time when this person never imagined they would stand in prayer at the depth of the night, not because they hated faith, but because life had slowly carried them far away from it. It didn't happen in one moment. It happened little by little. At first, it was just a missed prayer here and there. I'll make it up later, they told themselves. Days became weeks. Weeks quietly turned into months. The heart didn't feel the same connection anymore. Then other things began filling the empty spaces. Late nights with distractions. Endless scrolling on a glowing phone screen. Conversations that lasted hours but never really filled the emptiness inside. From the outside, life looked normal. Friends laughed with them. People thought they were doing fine. They attended gatherings, smiled in photos, joked about life like everyone else. But deep inside, there was a quiet feeling they could never escape. A feeling that something was missing. Sometimes they would hear the adhan echo from a nearby masjid. The sound would travel through the streets and slip gently through the windows. For a moment, their heart would pause, but the mind would quickly respond with excuses. You're too busy right now. Times you'll pray later. You're not ready yet. Days passed. More mistakes happened. Some small, some heavier, and slowly a dangerous thought began to grow in the back of their mind. A thought that whispers to many hearts, maybe you've gone too far. Times, maybe you're not the kind of person Allah wants anymore. That thought is one of the heaviest burdens a person can carry Because when someone believes they are too sinful to return, they stop trying. They stop knocking on the door of mercy. They stop believing forgiveness is meant for them. This person felt that weight often. There were nights when guilt crept into their chest unexpectedly, moments when memories of their choices replayed inside their mind. Sometimes they would sit alone and feel something tight inside their heart. Not pain from others, but pain from knowing they had drifted all, i.e., from the one who had given them everything. Still, the routine of life continued. Work, friends, social media, entertainment, sleep, days blending into each other. Until one night something changed. It was not a dramatic moment. No crowd, no speech, no sudden miracle. Just a quiet evening when the noise of the day had finally faded. They were sitting alone in their room, scrolling through their phone, letting videos play one after another, without really paying attention. Hours passed without meaning. Then suddenly the screen went dark. The battery had died. For the first time that night, the room was completely silent. No music, no voices, no distractions. Just the quiet sound of their own breathing. And in that silence, the thoughts they had been avoiding slowly began to return. The heart started asking questions that the mind had been running away from for a long time. What am I doing with my life? Why does everything feel empty, even when I have so much around me? They leaned their back against the wall, staring into the darkness. Memories appeared, one by one. Childhood days when prayer felt simple, moments when faith felt natural, times when the heart felt lighter. Then the present reality appeared beside those memories, the distance, the sins, the forgotten prayers. A heavy sigh escaped their chest, and the same painful thought returned again. You have gone too far. But something else followed that thought this time. A memory of words they had heard long ago, words about Allah's mercy being greater than any sin, words about a door that never closes as long as a person is still breathing. The heart listened carefully, because deep inside, every soul wants to believe that return is possible. They sat there for a long time thinking. Then slowly, almost hesitantly, they stood up, not because they suddenly felt worthy, not because they believed their past had disappeared, but because a small voice inside the heart whispered something simple: try. They walked to the sink and turned on the water. The sound echoed softly in the quiet room. As the water touched their hands and face, emotions began to rise that they had not felt in a long time. Regret, hope, fear, and a strange sense of relief. It felt like someone who had been lost for a long time had finally remembered the way home. When they spread the prayer mat, their hands trembled slightly. They knew their past, they knew the mistakes, but they also knew one thing: if Allah's mercy truly had no limits, then maybe even someone like them still had a chance. They raised their hands slowly. The room was still silent. The heart was beating fast, and the first words they whispered into the darkness carried years of regret inside them. Ya Allah, I know I'm late. Tears gathered quickly in their eyes, because sometimes the hardest step toward Allah is not the prayer itself. It is believing that after everything you have done, you are still allowed to come back. There was a night when everything felt like it was falling apart. the kind of night when the future looked uncertain, when the heart carried more questions than answers, and when every path ahead seemed covered in fog. This person had tried everything they knew. They had asked people for advice. Friends had given opinions. Family members had shared their thoughts. And everyone seemed to have a different answer. Some said, "Be patient." Others said, "Move on." Some simply said, "It will get better." But days passed, and nothing seemed to change. The problem remained. It sat in their chests like a heavy stone that refused to move. Sometimes they would sit quietly and stare into the distance, their mind racing through every possible solution. They thought about fixing it themselves. They thought about giving up completely. They thought about pretending it didn't matter. But no matter what they tried, the weight in their heart stayed exactly where it was. One evening, after another long day of thinking and worrying, they returned home feeling drained. Their body was exhausted, but their mind was still restless. They ate dinner without really tasting the food. Conversations around them sounded distant, like voices coming from another room. Eventually, the house grew quiet. Lights turned off one by one, doors closed, and the world around them slowly drifted into sleep. But sleep refused to visit them. They lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the same questions circling inside their head again and again. What if this never changes? What if things only get worse? What if I'm not strong enough for this? The clock on the wall ticked slowly. Minutes passed, and hours. At some point deep into the night, the room felt unusually still. The silence felt different from earlier, not empty, almost peaceful. They turned their head toward the window. The sky outside was dark, but the faint glow of the moon touched the edge of the curtains. And suddenly, a thought appeared, not loud, just a quiet reminder rising inside the heart. When was the last time you truly asked Allah? Not the quick dua whispered in a rush, not the casual prayer spoken while distracted, but the kind of dua that comes from a heart that has nowhere else to go. The person sat up slowly. Their chest felt tight with emotion, because deep down they knew the answer. It had been a long time. They had been trying to solve everything on their own, carrying the weight themselves, thinking, planning, worrying, repeating the same thoughts day after day. But that night, something felt different. The exhaustion had reached a point where the heart was ready to surrender. They stood up quietly and made their way to the bathroom. The house was completely silent. Even the smallest sound seemed louder in the stillness of the night. The water from the faucet flowed gently over their hands. They washed their face slowly, feeling the cool drops against tired skin. With each step of wudu, the heart felt slightly calmer, as if the soul itself was preparing for something it had been needing for a long time. Back in the room, the prayer mat was placed carefully on the floor. The light remained off. Only the faint glow from outside touched the room. They stood facing the Qibla, their heart beating softly but steadily. This was not a long prayer. This was not a moment filled with beautiful words or perfect recitation. This was simply a servant standing before the Lord with a heart that had run out of answers. They raised their hands, and the silence around them felt powerful. Because in that moment, there were no distractions, no phones, no conversations, no noise from the outside world. Just a heart speaking honestly for the first time in a long time. When they went into sujood, their forehead touched the ground gently, and suddenly the tears began to fall. Not dramatic cries, just quiet tears that slipped from their eyes and onto the prayer mat. Every fear, every doubt, every worry that had been building for days poured out in that moment. Words came slowly between the tears. Ya Allah, you know what I'm facing. The voice trembled. Ya Allah, I don't know what to do anymore. The chest felt lighter with every word spoken. Because sometimes the heart does not need a complicated speech. It only needs honesty. Minutes passed as they remained in sujood, whispering everything they had been holding inside. The darkness of the night surrounded the room. But inside that darkness, something powerful was happening. A servant was finally placing their burden in the hands of the one who controls everything. The problems were still there. The future was still unknown. But the heart was no longer carrying the weight alone. And somewhere between those quiet whispers and falling tears, one sincere dua rose into the unseen. A dua spoken from a place deeper than words. A dua that had the power to change everything.